welcome to our webinar. It's about planning your SharePoint migration. I'm joined with my colleague, Ben. Good afternoon, Ben.
Hello.
Hey, Ben. So this webinar is based on loads of experience. I said to Ben earlier, in a good month, we can be migrating, 1 million files for various clients. So we've been through a lot of pain, and hopefully we're going to share some things in this webinar, which will make your migration a little bit easier. But Ben, before we get to the detail, who's this for and what are they going to walk away with?
Yeah, so really this is targeted at the CIO or IT director type role, or again, perhaps in a smaller organization where those roles are outsourced. If you are a director of operations and you're considering preparing for a migration from file shares or some other system to SharePoint Online, the idea here is to give you some insight as to why these migrations potentially go wrong. Think about your SharePoint structure, think about the migration considerations, and really importantly, make sure you factor in user adoption.
Excellent. I think, we do get calls from people saying we're halfway through, we've hit a brick wall, and we're like, whoa, okay, maybe there was a different way of doing this. So hopefully these tips and advice will help. So Ben, we've been involved in migrations where someone's picked up the phone to us and said, look, I've tried to do this. I bought a tool. I've dragged everything from my P drive or S drive up to SharePoint. I've now got a million things which have gone wrong. Nothing's working and my users aren't happy. What went wrong here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing, the real key thing is scalability. So we have seen lots of scenarios where a customer has a million documents across all of their different departments in a single library, and they're synchronizing that using the OneDrive tool. And because of that volume of documents, it has real performance impacts. The syncing is taking over the CPU of those users' machines. And of course, those users are raising lots of IT support tickets when actually it's the structure of the SharePoint sites that's the problem. Browsing the documents becomes slow as well. The next thing is security. So when you've got a single library and you're treating it like your file share, where you've got lots of different folders, and then perhaps your IT team have got lots of granular security permissions applied, it becomes quite complex, quite difficult to manage, and you start to lose confidence that the documents in this folder are actually secure because you don't fully understand and it's not intuitive enough. And then the final point is usability. There's no real easy distinction between what perhaps is a working file that you may want to have synchronized versus approved files that are published versus records that need to be archived or somewhere else that you don't really need to look at that very much. When everything is in a single library, it doesn't really help that process. And for things like being able to use metadata and those other types of tools, you're not able to do it because it hasn't been thought through.
Ben, that was a really useful summary. Let's dive into the approach which we take, which naturally follows our EXP process.
Perfect. So we've got a high level standard process. We are information EXP, therefore all of the phases begin with EXP, as you can imagine. So just having a quick look at the beginning, the explore phase, key thing about this is to consider what is the purpose for carrying out this migration. Is it because you are looking to get off of your file servers? Because, perhaps the file servers have reached end of life, they're out of support. Or is it because you are perhaps merging with another organization and you want to be able to more easily collaborate with them? Maybe you've got lots of workers in different locations and it will make it easier for them to collaborate with each other. So what is the actual reason why you're doing this migration in the first phase? The next step, the explain phase, is all about designing this process, designing the right structures, analyzing your file share content, planning that migration, and really importantly, planning the user adoption so that people aren't going to be caught off guard when this migration takes place. So then we move on to the experience phase, or effectively the implementation phase. So at this point, we'll be checking the source environments, checking the targets, running a migration pilot so we know how much bandwidth we have to work with, how much data can we get up over a single weekend versus thinking about scheduling multiple batches over a period of time. And of course, actually preparing the site structures that we'll be migrating into. The expand phase is actually carrying out that migration alongside doing the end user adoption or training. So we're always thinking about making sure training has been done prior to the migration weekend so that all of the users know what to expect on the Monday afterwards. A key part of this, of course, is around reconciling that migration. So making sure that everything that was here has ended up there and that has been validated. And then the final step, of course, is providing that ongoing support. So once the migration has been taken place, you're going to get queries about, I can't find something, it should have been here, I'm not sure what's happened to it. And also, if this is the first time that you've actually started to roll out SharePoint, then your users are going to find that user experience a bit different, and there will be some teething problems as they learn how to use the tools.
But I mean, that's really helpful. And even bits as a subreddit itself, actually on our website, we published a 70 item plus checklist of things that you might want to consider as part of your migration. And that first piece, that purpose piece, that's really going to help you get buy-in from your sponsors, your stakeholders, because you are going to be changing the way people work. And so early communication and getting high level buy-in, absolutely key. Clearly, too much to cover in one webinar. So we're going to look at 5 key areas. The first one we're going to look at is site structure design. We're going to be looking at how do I design my target SharePoint environment? What are the considerations? Given that, we're then going to look into file share analysis, and Ben's going to explain why we do it this way around a little bit later. Then that migration execution, what that looks like, and we've got some demos lined up. And then that reconciliation, validating that we've got in the source and the target is matching. And finally, but really, really importantly, end user adoption. What are the considerations around that? SharePoint structure design, Ben. First step we're going to cover today, we're going to explore about SharePoint not being a file server. So how do we treat different kinds of files, the structure of what SharePoint might look like, how navigation supports that structure and directs people in the right directions, and ultimately a demo of what that navigation might look like. So let's go into the first bit then.
So realistically, we're always going to start with the big picture. The way I try and explain this to our clients is instead of thinking about what you have and how you're going to bring it over, think about what is the ideal structure for your organization as it now stands? What is that high level design, whether it's publishing areas, whether it's departmental workspaces, whether it's teams and projects and those types of things. So we need to go in and start thinking about that high level design first. We then need to consider our data journeys, how we go through that process of creating documents through to archive and potentially destroying those documents. We do need to factor in the compliance and governance aspects. Are there retention requirements? What about document records? What does that mean? How do we want to factor that in? So once we've designed our new structure, then we're going to go back and have a look at the source data and start to see how that is going to map into this new nicely designed structure that we've created. And obviously going into the low level, looking at those different department sites, breaking down areas for records and working documents and those types of things.
Okay. So one of the key challenges that we try to help people understand is SharePoint is not just a file server. It does a lot. And because of that, we need to consider different document types. So what are the types we've got in front of us, Ben?
Yeah, so really SharePoint, as Rupert said here, SharePoint is not a file server. It's a number of different things. The thing that people are most comfortable with or familiar with is that SharePoint is a collaboration solution. So it's a way of collaborating with each other and working on files and sharing and co-authoring. It's also a document management system. And there's obviously a lot of overlap between those two things. But if we think of a document management system, it's a way of filing documents and ensuring they're kept for a certain period of time. There's permissions, there's structures, there's metadata around it to ensure that it gets created or disposed of in the right way. Now, thirdly, SharePoint is a publishing platform. So if we're thinking about your company intranet, company portal, a way of presenting news to your employees, a way of publishing policies and other types of documents or resources for everyone to access. Now, the final point is that SharePoint can also be used as an application data platform. So whether that is lists of information storing issues or other types of transactions, that being used as the basis for some simple power apps or simple solutions that you may be developing in-house. Now, the thing is, reality is for today, we're only really going to focus on the first 3 because that's what we'll be considering when we're talking about migrating data into SharePoint.
Let's dive into a few use cases here, Ben, and maybe you could talk us through these.
Yeah. So the first one, collaboration workspaces. So probably the most traditional and the thing that closely relates to your existing file shares is those internal department areas. And particularly with things like support service departments, things like finance, HR, IT, They will often be self-contained spaces that store the documents that are used internally by those departments. Now, of course, we will then start thinking about spaces that will work across departments. So whether it could be something aligned to a particular process, whether it's supplier onboarding or something along those lines, or of course, if it's a project that again needs people from multiple departments to be able to work in a single place without this historical behavior of saving documents into their own respective department workspaces. And then finally, of course, it's a place where we can start collaborating externally. So if we're working with a supplier or working for our client and we want to be able to share information back and forth with them, we can create a space to do that. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but this will often be used in tandem with Microsoft Teams to have both a file space and a collaboration communication area. As we can see from the bottom of this, typically the behaviors of this is there'll be a relatively small number of contributors and few or no viewers. It's kind of a one-to-one relationship. Everyone is both a content creator and a content consumer in these scenarios, which is a bit different to some of those other scenarios that we'll see in a bit. So next one is about document management. So I think the key thing around this is it's less about departments and people collaborating together. The focus in this case is about a document scenario or process. So if you've got things like contracts management or employee records or invoice management, as I say, it's less about collaborating and people and more about the types of information that needs to be stored. Typically, these may be shared working spaces, something aligned to clients that multiple people need to feed into. There'll be defined audiences for who is contributing and who is reading. There'll be some compliance requirements where things need to be kept for a certain period of time or a certain level of sensitivity needs to be applied to it to protect those documents. We'll see here again, a small number of contributors, a small number of people editing these documents, but perhaps a slightly wider number of people that are going to have read access because they need to be informed or have access to what's going on.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And those contributors might actually be systems. So it could be an output like DocuSign, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then finally, Ben.
Yeah, and the final scenario is that publishing scenario where you're publishing content to something like an intranet. If you are in a support function like HR, yes, you'll have your HR collaboration workspace over there, but you're also going to have a place where you publish information out. And you don't really want to be mixing those things because they're very, very different audiences and use cases. So as I say, this could be support services, it could be internal comms preparing news stories, but it also could be published resources, whether that's things like policies and procedures for everyone to access or standard document templates or forms that people need to get access to. So again, in this scenario, we'll have a small number of contributors again, in terms of people owning this content, but a large number of viewers, potentially even the whole organization will have read access to these areas. So that ratio becomes much larger of content creator to content consumer.
Okay, Ben. So we've defined these different kind of areas where information sits. Now, the phrase that a lot of people might have heard is SharePoint hub site, but maybe not sure how this and that relate. So I think that's what we're going to dive to on the next slide. So Ben, what do we have?
So what we're doing now, we're thinking about our different use cases that we've thought through, whether it's different department collaboration spaces, publishing spaces. And then what we're going to need to think about is grouping those areas into a set of SharePoint site, all connected to some form of SharePoint hub site. So if we think in a large organization that's made up of multiple regions and each region has its own HR function, finance function, some level of operational function, and logically speaking, they collaborate very much with each other and occasionally collaborate with perhaps an alternative region. So as you can see here, we might have a hub for Europe, which logically groups all those sites together. The same thing goes, we may then go and have a hub site for the US. So again, similar repetition of the different types of sites and functions, but aligned to North America as opposed to Europe. So these hub sites collect other sites together and give them a shared consistent navigation as a way of easily moving back and forth, and also a shared search scope.
So Ben, we've done a lot of these SharePoint information architecture designs, and I think we see some trends, large organizations versus small organizations. Do you just want to go to the next level of detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is always a question as to how many hubs do I need? And sometimes there may be a desire perhaps to create a hub for every single department and all of the associated sites that go around that. In our experience, what we tend to find is the following. So for large organizations, perhaps more than 1,000 people, you'll be thinking of having some multiple hubs, and that might be aligned to divisions, business functions, or geographical regions, as we've just described before. If you're a smaller organization, I would generally try and steer people away from creating a hub for every department. I would group it more into the use cases of how people are behaving. So, what we often see is a dedicated intranet hub that will have all of the published resources, such as policies, news, HR published content, etc., in one place under a single navigation. Then we might see a collaboration hub for things like teams and projects and departmental workspaces. And then perhaps we might have a separate hub for filing. But realistically, it's normally going to be one or two hubs as opposed to just going and creating a hub for every single department that you have. So yeah, I think a point, just to summarize these final points. So a hub is a collection of different SharePoint sites under a common logical grouping or purpose. It provides those sites with a common navigation, which will allow people to easily move from one to another. It gives you a shared search scope. This is particularly useful in that intranet scenario where I just come to the intranet homepage. I want to search for some published content, but not be bombarded by results from all over the place. And then the final point we haven't really talked about here at all is we are not using the concept of subsites anymore. Microsoft have moved away from that. So instead of creating a big tree hierarchy of sites, we just create a collection of sites and join them up to these hubs.
Okay, but that's super helpful. So what you're saying is if I'm in that European hub and I search for leave policy, it's only going to bring back the leave policy in the European hub. Even if I have technically access to one in North America, it's going to focus a search on the one in Europe. Is that right?
That's right. That's exactly it. Yeah, exactly. We're focusing the result of that search.
Okay. I think it'd be useful at this point, Ben, to see actually what a hub looks like. So I'm going to bring up a SharePoint environment. Okay, Ben, so I've gone into our demo environment here. Tell me what I'm seeing.
Yeah, so what we're looking at is effectively the homepage for a given hub site. I think the key thing that this hub site gives us is that navigation bar that sits across the top. So as we click through into different areas, perhaps if we click into the clients area for a second, Rupert, if you don't mind, we'll see that as we go from one site to another, that hub navigation is there consistently. So it always allows you to easily go back and forth between the different areas. Now, although in this case, we're using a single hub site to collect everything together, and that is more appropriate for a smaller organization, we are still thinking quite carefully around what this navigation is doing and what are our different sites and how we work with them. So, Rip, if you don't mind going to the left-hand side, the rule of thumb that we follow here is everything on the left is for that wider audience. It's that publishing scenario. So if you look at the navigation links on the left, they should typically be those links that are part of your intranet that everyone has got access to. When we look in this structure on the navigation that Rupert's got up here, each of those headings about us people will be their own SharePoint site. And each of those SharePoint sites will have a series of pages and content that supports that particular purpose in that publishing scenario. If you go to the far right side of the navigation, so under department, this becomes much more that document collaboration workspace that everyone is both a content creator and consumer. So I'll have my finance site. Rupert might have the HR site, for instance. So we will just go into that and be able to work on those. And if I don't have access to it, I won't be able to see it from the navigation. Okay. So on the right-hand side, we've got the things which are, more workspace focused. And on the left-hand side, we've got the stuff that is more published. And then we have the stuff in the middle, which typically tends to be the document management scenarios. So they are content that is published or referenced, but still perhaps an element of collaboration. So it could be clients and sales, those types of things. Or in this case, we've got knowledge and policies or projects, those types of areas.
Perfect, Ben. So let's just summarize what we've seen in this section. So what I've heard from you today is think about the ideal structure you'd like for your working environment rather than the data you've got already. And then we're going to look at how we map that data into that new future state later. We talked about hubs, smaller companies, and we say under 1,000 people, but it does depend on the complexity and maybe the jurisdictions of your organization, that a single hub is often the best route forward. By creating additional complexity, you're going to make it difficult for your user experience. So think about that. And then finally, when you're creating something, naturally, most organizations, the volume of data is going to expand. So that's another consideration there, saying, well, this is where we are today. Where else are we going to be in the future? Let's jump on to the explain phase, and we're diving particularly into file server analysis. So we're going to be talking about the impact of files, volume of data, what does growth look like, the file types which sit happily in SharePoint and those which don't, and that management life cycles. What are we trying to identify here?
Yeah, so I think the first point here is really key. Actually, in a lot of cases, it's less about the volume and more about the number of files and folders when we're designing and structuring our SharePoint site. Don't get me wrong, the volume of data is important when you're planning the execution of the migration because it will have an impact on the bandwidth that you have and how much time it's going to take to go. But in terms of the actual structure of your SharePoint site, it's the numbers of files that is going to have a bigger impact just because of the way that SharePoint works. Having said that, you do need to make sure you have enough tenant storage in your Microsoft SharePoint tenant. If you're coming from a 40 terabyte file server, and actually because of the number of users you have, you only have licenses for say 2 terabytes of data in SharePoint, you need to be thinking very carefully about if you actually need to bring everything over. And then the third thing to consider is we do want to think through the different types of scenarios, whether it's filing or working document type scenarios, because that will have an impact on how we structure the set of SharePoint document libraries in our sites. The point that's just picked up on there is that any library that's got greater than 100,000 documents in it needs to be considered quite carefully. If you look at the documentation, Microsoft will tell you that SharePoint can store millions of files. But that is actually only really useful in practice if it is very much a highly structured filing scenario as opposed to a day-to-day working scenario. And the key impact on this 100,000 figure is if you want to synchronize that library so it appears on your local machine and you can work on it natively and intuitively, the OneDrive tool that does this syncing cannot really cope comfortably if that library has got more than 100,000 files in it. So it does need to be considered quite carefully.
So Ben, when we look at the content in our source, how are we categorizing? What are these categories we've got in front of us?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do, in our experience, we found that the folders and files will tend to fall into these 5 different categories when you're preparing for your migration. Now, don't get me wrong, there may be other categories that you think of, but broadly speaking, we have these 5 types of information when we're doing our analysis. The first is the working document. So these are things like the trackers, that live Excel tracker sheet that everyone has to go and update and work on. We might have things like plans, project plans, other types of document, whether it's RFPs or other things that we're kind of working on as well. And generally having a space that's just work in progress. I'm drafting some documents, I'm thinking stuff through, I'm actively going in and updating it and working on it. Then we have documents that are published. So that could be things like a case study document that has been prepared from marketing that may get published to an intranet site or into a more formal filing area for people to be able to use and refer to. We also see things like reports. So if you're in a department that needs to prepare reports that are shared with the executive leadership team, for instance, you will often prepare these reports and then publish them out for them to be consumed. They may have come from the work in progress area, but then they're going to get filed and shared off for people to access. Thirdly, we have these reference documents. So they may be things like internal SOPs or guidelines. It could be training manuals for some software packages that you use. It could be some reference information that you've downloaded or accessed from a third-party source. So we want to be able to keep those in a nice, tightly and carefully managed areas so it's easy to actually get to that information. So it's adding the most value. The fourth point here is around records. So we see quite a lot of this, obviously, for things like invoices, contracts, employee records, things that need to be kept for a period of time. You have obligations perhaps to keep these types of documents for 7 years, whereas your work in progress trackers and things, well, you could throw them away. It's not the end of the world necessarily. And then finally, of course, there's going to be a whole load of stuff in your file server that you're not really sure if you need it anymore. You're not using it. You don't necessarily want to delete it or get rid of it, but it's not really being actively used. So you might create a completely separate archive space to store that, whether it's a completed project or some historical initiative that you did a few years ago that you wouldn't want to get rid of just yet.
And I think the other thing which is useful about this is we probably see common traits about where metadata is applied, so more likely to be maybe in the published area, and also the compliance needs. So where do retention policies play a big part? And that could be under the records area, for example. So there's going to be themes, I think, around the information management based on the source of content. Okay, Ben, a couple of scenarios here which we've seen in real life. So just run through these for us, will you?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, once we've designed our SharePoint site structures, we need to start planning what SharePoint document libraries we need. So if you're perhaps in an operations team that works with lots of different clients, and actually you've got a single folder for all of your clients, and we've seen this scenario where perhaps there's 500,000 files within that client's area, we really need to be thinking about that quite carefully. As I said, if you just put all of that into a single library and try and sync it, it's going to be very, very low performance. It's going to be quite difficult to work with. So what we'd recommend in this scenario is creating a document library per client. So what we're effectively doing is repeating out that library structure for every client so that the likelihood of someone syncing all libraries at once is quite low. And they just go in and sync the ones that they're actively working on, for live clients versus perhaps clients that are a bit more inactive. The second scenario that we see is something like in a finance folder where you've got 5,000 or so active documents. And then on the other hand, we've got this 150,000 or so transaction records. These are invoices or whatever it is that you have, those things that need to just be pushed in and filed. So instead of syncing those transaction records, put them in a separate library. You can just use SharePoint to go and push them in, search for them if you need to. But then you've got your nice clean library where you're going to go and work on those active documents. And those are the ones you're going to sync.
Okay, Ben. And before we just show people how we analyze files, I think there's a few things that we like to watch out for, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always these gotchas. So that could be different types of files, such as third-party files, Adobe Photoshop, CAD drawings. CAD is the thing that we do encounter quite a lot. So what we will generally recommend is if you want to be able to work and design files using CAD or Adobe InDesign or those types of things, I'm not really convinced that trying to have SharePoint as your workspace to do that is the right thing to do. You're better off maintaining either an on-premise file structure that's dedicated just to that, or start looking at using Azure file servers instead. The reason is how all of those files rely on the interactions between each other, and SharePoint isn't going to do that for you realistically. So you do need to be thinking about those. The other one is access databases. Access databases need to live on a file server or a local drive or a network share. They cannot be opened and used interactively from SharePoint sites. So if you're heavy access users, you do need to be thinking about moving away or again, maintaining a file server presence for that. Things like application software, documents that have got macros that rely on other file shares and areas to go and interact with. And then of course, the final point is if you've got spreadsheets that have lots of links to other spreadsheets, all of those links are going to get lost when you move over to SharePoint and they're potentially going to need to be rebuilt. So having an idea of what these gotchas are going to be in advance and trying to mitigate for them is going to be quite key. The final point, which catches people out quite a lot, is very, very long folder path. So if you see you've got folders that are almost sentences long, that have documents that have got sentence long file names on them, this can be very problematic, both from reconciling your migration, but even hitting the maximum path length in SharePoint, which is 400 characters. So you will need to look at shortening some of that structure in advance.
Okay, Ben. So that's what to watch out for. let's go and have a look at how we find these things and how we start our analysis. We've set up a demo environment here in Azure. We've got a few applications installed. Do you want to take me through how you start analyzing a client's environment?
Yeah, so realistically, you're going to need access to some tools. Now, in our case, this demo is really focused on a file share as opposed to something like Google or Dropbox. With the file share migrations, we recommend using a tool called Tree Size. Now, I imagine if you're doing this for real, you're going to have significantly more data than we do, but this is obviously a demo, as you can appreciate. So we've opened Tree Size, and what we're looking to do here is effectively get a summary and extract that we can start using to prepare our migration. Now, what Tree Size gives you is a really nice all up view so you can get an intuitive feel of how big this data structure is and which areas are bigger than others. Now, what I will do just very quickly, because we can also use this to start detecting some of the slightly unusual file types as well. So, Rupert, if you go to the Extensions tab, please. What we can see here, it's giving me a bit of a categorization of the different types of files. And we can see that perhaps the majority of our files are Office files. So we don't need to worry about those too much. They're going to go over into SharePoint really happily. We've got some video content, some image files. We've also got some database files. So let's just go and expand those. So this might be an Access database that we need to think through and think, okay, maybe we're not going to bring that over. So where are those files? We can go and find them and analyze them. Again, we might have mail files. So if people have got things like, archive PST folders, for instance, in this case, it's just a mail message. But, if you've got archive PST folders, for instance, you don't want to be migrating that into SharePoint. That shouldn't be going over. So this is going to give you an idea of any kind of troublesome file types that we need to be thinking about in advance. Now, what we're going to do is we need to get this extract so we can start doing our analysis and mapping it to our new structure. So Rupert, if you want, just going back to the details pane a second. So what we're going to do now is run an export of this. Now we're going to do two exports, actually. The first is at this high level. This is going to help us start mapping out what SharePoint sites we're going to go to. And then in a minute, we'll do the level below, which is where we can start cataloging within each department area, whether it's archive, reference, working documents, records, et cetera, et cetera. Rupert, if you wouldn't mind going to the Scan tab, please. What we're going to do is click on the Export button. So yeah, if you can just do that. Now, it's worth very quickly just going and customizing the export before we do anything else. Just having a look at some of these settings. What we're interested in is just making sure we're only exporting the elements that are in the current view. We don't want to go through the whole tree at the moment. We just want to see what the current level is. So that's fine as it is. That's fine. We've got that configured. Just press OK. And then we're just going to go and save that. So we're then going to go a level below. So if you just go and expand into marketing or double click into marketing, that's it. Yeah. So we can now see that sub level. Again, we're going to go and run an export for marketing. Now, realistically, you would go and do that for all of the sub level folders from that top level. We're just going to do it for marketing for the moment. Yeah, fine. That should be fine. Good. So we've used Tree Size. It's given us an idea of what we're dealing with. We can see which the large areas are we need to start planning for. The other thing I do really like this, of course, I haven't said earlier, is it tells you here which libraries have got large numbers of files and folders at this view. So we can see both the size and the number to see if we're going to have a problem with that 100,000 mark at any point. Okay. So I think now that we've got that, we're going to go and have a look at those exports in Excel. Great. So we've got this open. Now, what we've done, this has generated an Excel sheet, and we've just gone in and added an additional column here. And the idea is to say, okay, for each of the high level folder structures, obviously it's quite simple in our case because it's a demo. But if you click into each of those, ideally what you would do is go and have an option that you put as a drop down option in your Excel sheet for each of the new SharePoint sites that you created. Then you can go through this or work with your colleagues on this to go and catalog every folder that you have and align it to a SharePoint site. Now, if you find that there are some folders that aren't really owned by anyone, it may make sense to have a dedicated archive SharePoint site for any of that historical data that doesn't align to a given department. Let's go and have a look at the subfolder sheet as well. So Rupert's brought this together into a single sheet here. So again, what we've done now is gone down to that second level. Now, obviously, you may find you have to go to multiple levels to do this, but broadly speaking, you can then go through to that second level and catalog it as either records, working docs, etc. And that will give you an idea of where you want to start migrating this to. Typically speaking, what we find ourselves doing is going and creating those 5 libraries within the SharePoint site itself. So we'll create a dedicated reference library or a records library. The working docs will map to the default SharePoint document library as well. So we don't need to create a dedicated one for that. But what we then will often do is encourage our clients to take this spreadsheet and go and give it to the respective department heads. They're not going to be able to go and do all of this analysis, or your IT team aren't going to do this. So you go and take this, give it to the head of marketing or someone in marketing and ask them to fill this in. So they've got all of this information available and they can go through and catalog it. You may need to give them a bit of help and encouragement and clarification around the process. And finally, you may want to be considering doing some tidy up, but it just helps people to start to think through doing some cataloging on the data that they have.
Okay, so takeaways from this section. If you're coming from a file server or a file share, look at something like Tree Size Professional so you can actually understand what's in your environment. If you're coming from a cloud environment, consider Microsoft Migration Manager. That's going to give you some analytics and some information about what's stored in those environments. Now, for every item or every folder level anyway, you need to understand where that sits and build the aggregated view of how we're going to then drive to a final stage, which is classifying data, and then taking that, as Ben explained at the end, of how that is going to map into document libraries. So you're going to go through this journey of understanding where your data started from, where we're going to move it to, and making sure that we've got the structure in SharePoint to support that. Then let's move on to migration. So 2 key things. We're going to be looking at how we set up a migration tool, very high level here, and then also some considerations around home drives and OneDrives. So Ben, migration execution, we've taken 8 of the key steps from our 70-point checklist here. Can you just run through those so we understand exactly what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So stage 1, we're going to run a pre-scan with the purpose of identifying any areas that might have some restricted access. We'll take our mapping from Excel, mapping to that level 1 and level 2 folder hierarchy, and we'll go and make sure we've got that aligned to the appropriate SharePoint site and its target document library. And then we'll go through and generate a CSV file that will be used within the SharePoint migration tool that says this folder goes to this SharePoint site. So once we've got our CSV file, we're going to load this into the SharePoint migration tool. We'll look at some basic settings and we'll kick off that migration. We'll need to run a proof of concept. So we'll do all of this using a migration pilot. This will identify if we've got any issues with things like accessing the internet via proxy servers. And in particular, we'll be able to get an idea of what our bandwidth is going to be and how much data is going to go up over a single weekend or multiple weekends. So we need to think about the best time to migrate. Typically, we would start at 6 p.m. on a Friday or perhaps over a bank holiday weekend, looking to complete all of the migration activities during the weekend so that people can come in on a Monday morning. If we can't do this on a bank holiday weekend, then yes, do it over a weekend. And then the worst case scenario is do it over a single evening. But generally in the week is less advised.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. That's a good part of the proof of concept is, how fast can we move these files from A to B? And the more you can mirror your proof of concept to your production run, the closer results you're going to get.
Yeah.
And Ben, should we just dive back into our demo environment and bring a bit of this to life?
Yes.
Okay, Ben, back in the demo environment, I'm looking at a CSV file here.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're looking at here is a very simple CSV file that is in the format used by the SharePoint migration tool. So what we've effectively done is identify each of the source libraries and tell it what SharePoint site and library it's going to be migrated to. So once we've got that format, we're going to load, in our case, the SharePoint migration tool. There are other tools, of course, but the one that we found that works really well for SharePoint file share migrations is the one from Microsoft itself. So we're going to start a new migration. If you click on that button, please. And then in our case, we're going to load from a JSON or CSV file. So if you just click on that and just choose the file. So we're going to go and find that file that we created, which is the mapping. We can see it's been able to identify the source and target. We can give this migration a name if we choose to do so. We're not going to worry about that right now. And then we're just going to press next. So when we do that, we're going to be presented with some settings. I talked about doing this pre-scan before. So if you're just doing a pre-scan, you would click on the top button that says only perform scanning. Now we've done that already, so we're going to turn that off. We're actually going to migrate the data. Now, one point to note is there is an option to preserve file share permissions. I must strongly caution you against this. It can result in lots of problems. And what you'll often find is that some of the issues that you have in terms of permissions in your file share are simply going to get replicated as you go up to SharePoint. So we'd always recommend designing a clean structure in SharePoint and not preserving the file share permissions as we migrate over. So Rupert, if you wouldn't mind just click on the view all settings, there's a few more settings we need to have a look at. So if we go down a little bit, please, if that's okay. One of the things we do want to consider is this about invalid file name characters. So instead of simply throwing an error, if there are some unusual file name characters that SharePoint identifies in the source, just replace them with an underscore. So we use this quite a lot. The other thing that we'll often do is run this migration up to 5 successive times. What this will deal with is if there's any network timeout. So if, for instance, it's gone through, it's been able to migrate most of the data, but for a period of time, there was a network timeout. What this does is it's just keep running until it's been able to validate that it's been successful. In reality, it's often not going to run 5 times. It might run 2 or 3 until it's confident that it's been completed. Actually, Rupert, if you don't mind scrolling up a second, actually, there is one final setting I'd like to highlight, which is including hidden files. So the default setting is not to include hidden files. And again, we would generally recommend that you keep this. The reason is that typically those hidden files are going to be things like the thumbs.db that people with Macs might have had, for instance, or some of those other types of temporary files that Microsoft Office keeps open. And you don't really want to bring this stuff over. It's going to be a bit of a mess. However, if you are regularly, deliberately hiding certain files or folders, you do need to consider that. So we're just going to save that. And once we've done that, we're just going to push the migration button and let it run.
So Ben, we're doing a live migration on a webinar. That's
live
exciting.
Migration on a webinar. Yeah. So we can see here there's a bit of progress. We'll see that progress bar as it's going through. And sometimes it's just a case of sitting and watching or leaving it to run overnight and coming and checking it on a Saturday morning.
So Ben, looks like we finished.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you can see in this case, we only migrated 147 megs, took about 4 minutes. You can see how that could start to scale. On average, I see about 20 gigs an hour or so potentially. So you want to think about how you run your batches and potentially schedule a few migrations over the course of your weekend.
So Ben, I've come back into our SharePoint environment. I know we migrated some files into employee records, so let's go and have a look at those.
Yeah, so absolutely. Those files have been migrated. Perhaps if you just click into the top folder there. Now, the thing that is just worth highlighting, of course, is the value of using that migration tool is making sure that it brings over the modified dates and the modified by. So instead of it showing like it all just got migrated today by the current person, it recognizes that those files were created 2-3 months ago or 3-5 years ago. So that's one of the key points about using a migration tool to do that.
So a few key pointers here just for OneDrive migrations, which are slightly separate to SharePoint migrations, although you're using the same underlying platform.
Yeah, so realistically, OneDrive is going to be the target of your home drives. You know, if you've got individual users have their own home drive folder, they should be mapped and migrated into each user's OneDrive. What you'll need to do is make sure that each user's OneDrive has been set up in advance. And the way that you can do that is use PowerShell to effectively precede those OneDrive sites. You will need to make sure that the account used to run the migration has been given admin access to every user's OneDrive. Otherwise, they won't actually be able to push the data up. So that is a process that you're going to have to go through and get ready in advance before running the OneDrive migration.
Perfect. That's a useful pointers there. So let me summarize this section. So number one is we need to review the structure of what you've created in your SharePoint environment and then see how that configures with your CSV mapping files. And as you saw there, we actually did some drop downs in Excel to help create those mapping files. There's obviously that piece there when you're in the configuration tool is how do we get rid of those funky characters? What do we do about hidden files? And then the final tip that Ben had there was when you're running the tool, configure it to run 5 times so it's going to deal with those network timeouts that you mentioned. The files are migrated. Reconciliation is next. I think this is a really important part and one which often gets overlooked. And the key reason why you really do need to do this is if a file does get overlooked, even if you can still get it from your source environment, you're going to start losing confidence in your SharePoint migration. So I think that is the why. But Ben, a bit more detail here would be super helpful.
Yeah, so I think that's the key thing. The tools are not flawless. If there's a funny character or slightly unusual duplicate character, for instance, in a file name, you may find that a file gets dropped. It's not always going to throw up as an error. It's not always that obvious that has happened. The second thing is it gives you a report that can be used to validate and be presented to our client if you're doing this on their behalf, or to your leadership team if you're running this internally. It's almost like that final record that says this has been done. And then the final point, because this always happens, is once that migration has happened or has taken place, users are going to come back to you and say, I can't find this. I'm not sure where that went. And you're going to refer back to that reconciliation sheet to validate that, yes, in fact, this did go from here to there. And actually, perhaps it was that the user subsequently accidentally dragged it and dropped it into a different folder or pushed the delete button by accident. So it gives you that reference to say, at this point in time, this is what it looked like.
That's the why. Let's look onto the how.
Yeah. So what you'll need to do is use a separate tool. I don't recommend just simply relying on the logs from the migration tool that you use itself. So our approach is that we'll run PowerShell scripts against the source and the target environment. That effectively is going to list out every single file into a CSV file on both sides. We'll bring that data together into Excel and we'll create a pivot table from both the source and the target. We then use the Power Query tools to effectively map a reference from each source file and cross-reference it against each target file. And that's able to flag up any issues where something doesn't quite match up.
Excellent, Ben. Okay, as I was saying, we use a separate tool to validate our source, our destination. The goal is to find that needle in the haystack. The file that people can't find is normally the most important one. And this is all about building confidence. The other part of that is that reconciliation report, as Ben touched on earlier. We should normally show a view from a pivot table, which will show the file numbers on one side matching on the other side, which in turn creates confidence. There will still be cases where people say they can't find files, and we use that Excel spreadsheet to help resolve user issues, pointing out, look, your file's now in this location. Maybe it was the way it's mapped, but giving the support teams a way of being able to quickly resolve user issues. So that's the technical piece out of the way, Ben. Let's just touch on user adoption before we wrap this up. New ways of working. This is particularly targeted for organizations where they're moving to SharePoint and they haven't used SharePoint before, or maybe they just limit it to maybe intranet type usage. So a few key considerations here. I don't think it's worth going through them all one by one, but some of the key things that we do cover is the syncing tool, because that gives people a familiar environment to how they access files already. And the other piece is around version history and file naming. So there's no longer a need to put underscore Bob's version, Sue's version. That can all happen automatically. But for each scenario, we'll do a needs analysis of the client, work out where the best value can be, and build that training program. As a final piece on this, we've got an example timeline of how we do user adoption. Ben, do you just want to run through how your experience has created this plan?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key point about this is to make sure you train your users before the migration, but not too far before. So if you think for each area of your organization that you'll be migrating, have this sort of T-4 weeks plan. 4 weeks previous, you're creating the communications, scheduling that training and making sure that everyone can attend. 2 weeks before, you're going to deliver that end user training, whether it's face to face over Teams, etc., and you're going to provide those slide decks, and you're going to be telling people this is what you're going to experience, and this is where you're going to find your data on the following Monday. 1 week before, considering running refresher training webinars and make sure you've got your migration prepped. Over the weekend, do the migration, do the reconciliation, and set all of the source folder structures to read only so that people don't just accidentally go back to those original areas and just keep working. And then in the week and subsequent weeks after, perhaps give users access to some refresher videos or snippets or how-to content, publish that to the intranet alongside the help desk support that you're going to be providing them.
Excellent. Super helpful. I think just to summarize, it's hard to win back confidence in SharePoint after a poor migration. We've spoken to a number of organizations where they're on an uphill struggle. And I think the second point is if you move things into SharePoint and it's not the ideal structure and you're looking to do a significant re-architecture, you're probably looking at a tool to help you do that. And you're spending thousands of dollars to buy that tool. That's not one that Microsoft provides for free. People side, we talked about the adoption program and training, and typically we see a third or maybe a half of our budget on a project often goes around that adoption piece to make sure that people are ready for the technology. And then finally, even once you've gone live and afterwards, the business will keep evolving or your organization's needs will change. And therefore, the way you structure information in SharePoint will probably change too. So that's something, a consideration. This will not be how things are for life, but they are, good for right now. So that brings the webinar to an end. If you think that we could help you on your journey, I thought I'd just share with you how we approach SharePoint migrations, but SharePoint projects in general. We start with an explore phase, which is a couple of workshops to help identify what is the scope of this. And we talked about the purpose at the top of the webinar, that fact finding, and a bit of Ask if Possible to get people excited about SharePoint. And what comes out of that explore is a scope to what this actual migration looks like in terms of both the technical side, but also the adoption side. And then finally, once you're in SharePoint, depending on the level of support and resources you have yourselves, you might want to look at a support service. We have our expert success service, which helps organizations using SharePoint and Teams. Thank you for your time today. I hope that was useful. Ben, thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot.